Welcome to Channel 24. My guest is David Patrikarakos, is a British author, journalist, podcaster, and war correspondent. He is best known for his book War in 140 Characters, where he explains how modern wars are fought not only with weapons, but with stories, information, and influence. David has reported from conflict zones around the world and has spent some time in Ukraine, closely following how Russia wages this war, both on the ground and in the informational space. So, David, it's my pleasure to welcome you here in our studio. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I'm a big admirer of the show and of all your work, so thank you very much.
So my first question, David, from everything you've seen and written about modern warfare, is the West still trying to manage this Russia's war in Ukraine instead of helping Ukraine win it?
Look, that's a very good question. And I think the West, in this sense, cannot be treated as a homogenous whole. I think the Europeans are still very committed to Ukraine winning the war, whatever winning means, which we can talk about later. And perhaps the Trump administration is more committed to managing the war and ensuring that its relations with Russia, not least it appears economic relations, remain intact. So I think that's where we are right now politically.
And President Zelensky has signaled that Ukraine may step back from its NATO ambition ahead of peace talks that are happening right now in Berlin, you know. From your perspective, is this a tactical move to gain security guarantees or a strategic concession that could weaken Ukraine's position in the long term?
Another good question. Look, I personally don't think that that NATO would ever allow Ukraine into it. I think the problems from Russia would be too much. So I think it's probably a wise thing to say. I don't know if it will make a huge amount of difference. Look, I mean, I've been reporting Ukraine from the beginning of the war, by which I mean 2014, not the all-out invasion in 2022. As you know more than me, Ukraine is being attacked by Russia for 11 years, not 3, or almost 4 now. It is my belief that Putin is not going to stop. Dmitry Kuleba, the former foreign minister of Ukraine, was on a podcast of mine a while back, and he said something that stuck with me forever. He said, if Putin loses in Ukraine, he is the first Tsar in Russian history to lose in Ukraine. This is unacceptable for him. I believe this to be true. I believe Putin to be a Tsar, even if he's called a president. He's turned the entire Russian economy towards war now, and I don't think he could stop even if he wanted to, and I don't think he wants to stop. I think right now for Ukraine, politically, you have to manage the American relationship to the best degree you can, hope that some kind of change comes at the US midterms, and hope that the Europeans continue to increase the support. Let me be very clear here. As a British person, it is my belief, and it has always been my belief, that Ukraine is not fighting merely for Ukraine, but for all of us. Ukraine is now a garrison state for the West in Europe against Russian imperialism. It's that simple.
It's that simple. Yeah, that's a very nice quote of former foreign minister Dmytro Kuleba. But do you see this Zelensky message on NATO as diplomacy under pressure?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think Zelensky and most Ukrainians would want to join NATO if given the chance, which is interesting because obviously if we look at polling before 2014, it was a very different story. But I think it's clear now that if Ukraine had been in NATO, it might have been a different story. I mean, security guarantees are, of course, a good thing, but we, of course, remember the guarantees that were made to Ukraine by Russia, by the United States, by, unfortunately, my country, Britain, guarantees of its territorial integrity. It gave up the nuclear weapons that it had in its territory after the fall of the Soviet Union. They came to nothing. I think the biggest security guarantee Ukraine has is the might and efficiency of the Ukrainian army, which I've experienced firsthand, again, not for 4, 3, 5 years, but 11 years.
Yeah, David, that's a good point, because I was always thinking, why wouldn't NATO want Ukraine in it when we are the only one of the most having one of the most strongest armies in the world right now in action?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that NATO understands that it would just be too much trouble from the Russians. And I actually think that this is a very immoral thing that NATO has done and the West has done. we saw this in 2008 when it led Georgia and Ukraine to believe that they might be joining NATO, and then they pulled back at the last minute, and then, however many months later, Putin was in Georgia. So I think that the people should be actually clear about this. I could be wrong, but I don't foresee Ukraine joining NATO anytime soon. Was Zelensky's public statement diplomacy under pressure? I'd say absolutely it was. Look, Zelensky is under huge pressure. Ukraine is under huge pressure right now. We all know this. We all hope that Ukraine is able to manage the situation politically to the best degree that it can, to appease to the degree that is possible the Trump administration, with an understanding that whatever Putin tells Trump, he doesn't care about Trump. He's going to do what he wants to do. And the disappointing thing is that this is very clear in the dealings they've had already. Every time Trump says something, he just ignores it. Putin clearly doesn't care about Donald Trump. And why the American president believes that a man who has said on record that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, why he believes a man like this has any kind of love or like for America, the country that more than any other was responsible for the fall of the Soviet Union, is completely beyond me. Absolutely crazy.
Yes. And if Ukraine gives up NATO without a clear security framework, do you think that will send a message to the other world? And what message will it send?
Yeah, if Ukraine does that without an exchange for a security guarantee, however hollow that might be, that would be seen as, I think, unabashed weakness, and that should be avoided. But I think that politically, look, I think that they can make it, I think there can be a trade. You give up NATO membership, in theory, you get a security guarantee in theory. But, guarantees in theory and on paper are not, like the guarantees I've seen in Bakhmut and Kreminna and Debaltseve and Kharkiv and all the other places where I was there, and Ukrainian hard power was what was keeping Russians from invading the various fronts that I was placed in with the Ukrainian soldiers. This, unfortunately, is the ultimate security guarantee that Ukraine has, and is the Ukrainian armed forces.
Yeah, we as Ukrainians know about security guarantees a lot, and some of them are pointless. So, yeah, absolutely, you're right. And while preparing for our interview, David, I just heard yesterday an argument that really stuck with me. The idea is this. When you confront a nuclear power like Russia, there are no real security guarantees for you because before and after, you will still be Russia will still be a nuclear power country. So what's the point of it?
Well, look, we still need to operate within a framework of treaties and laws and norms. The alternative is the kind of chaos and anarchy that I feel Tsar Putin would like to visit on much of Europe and much of the West. So Ukraine still has to operate within diplomatic norms. And I guess if Putin is in clear violation of a treaty and security guarantees made more recently, you would hope that political pressure may force other allies, possibly the United States, to intervene on Ukraine's behalf if those guarantees are egregiously and violated, as Putin has egregiously violated ceasefires, agreements before. That's the best that one can hope for in what is an imperfect and increasingly hard and cruel world.
Absolutely. If Russia remains a nuclear power with the same strategic capabilities after the war, what actually changes for Ukraine or for the West? Why would deterrence suddenly work later if it does not work right now?
Well, look, I think Russia is definitely going to remain a nuclear power, so that needs to be accepted. Look, we don't know, but the biggest deterrence over the last 11 years, and especially since the all-out invasion in 2022, I think, clearly has been Ukraine's ability to prevent Russia from conquering the country in total. That's what it is, I think. And I think if Zelensky is forced to make some kind of concessions, if he is forced to the negotiating table, the best Ukraine can hope for is that sufficient guarantees will be put in place that if Putin flagrantly violates them, the political pressure on Ukraine's allies to act in its defense will be so great that they are at least forced to take some kind of action. That's all we can hope for. But I repeat, Ukraine's best security guarantee, Ukraine's best form of deterrence remains the Ukrainian armed forces, with obviously assistance by their Western allies for money, equipment, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with you regarding that one. And you often write about narratives shaping reality. Has the West trapped itself in its own story of avoiding escalation, while Russia never believed in such a story at all?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, this whole idea of escalation management that was so beloved by Jake Sullivan and the people around him, I never understood. Look, either support Ukraine fully or just tell it to surrender. It'll just say, just surrender, we're not going to help you. But this, I don't even call it, half-assed. I call it three-quarters-assed. I never understood why we gave Ukraine 80% of what it needed 3 months after it most needed it. I will never understand that. This idea that, you want to help Ukraine, but not enough, not quite enough for fear of angering Russia too much, never made any sense to me. And I think had Ukraine been given the full level of support that it needed in the early stages of the all-out invasion, we might be in a different place now.
Yeah, I just recently saw an amazing article in the Times, and the title of it was like that: "I'm sorry, Ukraine, for some kind of for letting you down." So do you see that as the whole picture of the West supporting Ukraine for the last 4 years like this?
Well, no, I'd say that, the West did a lot, right? I mean, without Western support, Ukraine might not have held the Russians at bay. So, sorry, the connection froze for a minute. So, yeah, I do feel that we could have given, Ukraine much more support. But I think at the same time, I was always worried that Western support would dry up. And it hasn't dried up, actually. I remember, I'm a journalist. I remember thinking, yes, okay, I was in Ukraine. I was near Rubizna, I think, on the front with the Dnipro battalion. And I remember thinking, wow, it's April. This is still on the front pages every day. I wonder how many more weeks it will last. And, a year, 2 years later, Ukraine was still dominating all of the global headlines, essentially until Gaza. So, I'm proud of the fact that we didn't abandon Ukraine totally. I'm disappointed, but also confused as to why we never gave it the full support it needed, which might have brought a cleaner end to things or made Ukraine's position stronger, that actually we could have had a quicker end, at least a cessation of hostilities. I will never understand that. And I think it's unfortunate and short-sighted.
And also, after the meeting with the Ukrainian President Zelensky last week on his off-the-record conference, but, we have such off-the-records with him when it's off-the-record, but in 3 hours, everything is published, right? So, and what he said that actually, unfortunately, this Russian incursion into the NATO airspace worked very well. And the European cities slowed down their military support for Ukraine, actually.
Because of the NATO incursion?
Yes.
Because of the incursion to NATO. Yeah. Again, if this is the case, and let's see, I mean, we have to do, Britain now is out of the EU, so it can do more independent responses, but that would just be absolutely cretinous. I mean, I have this debate with people every so often. People say, Putin would never attack NATO, that would be insane. And I always make the point, look, Putin doesn't need to fight a war with NATO. He just needs to destroy its credibility. He needs to destroy the idea of NATO. Now, NATO, in the end, when we come down to it, sits on Article 5, right? Collective defense. That's NATO. Without that, NATO's done. Now, if Putin can, send drones into NATO countries, if he can start to do small incursions, and he sees no invocation of Article 5, he sees no desire for collective defense, NATO's done. It's finished. Doesn't matter if it still exists. He doesn't need to go to war with it. And I think he's calculating, with Trump in the White House, if he does something in Estonia, Latvia, will Trump want to go to war for Estonia? Most Americans probably haven't even heard of Estonia. And I think this is the danger when we allow these incursions, these provocations beyond Ukraine onto NATO territory. And it's the kind of thing where you just invite more and more and more of them. It's the same thing as escalation management all over again. Well, let's not do too much in case it angers the Russians. But obviously all that happens is the Russians do more and more and more. It's a vicious cycle, and one that we've seen from history and one that we are seemingly refusing to learn from.
Yeah, and Russia spends billions on missiles and drones while talking about peace. David, how important is this contradiction in the informational war? And is the West doing enough to expose it clearly?
Look, it's the key to everything. Putin has always, or until 2022, always cloaked his imperialism in the language of human rights, the language of democracy. Now he barely bothers anymore. But you saw this very early on, when I was in Slavyansk in 2014, April the 12th, the night they took the police station. I was the first Western journalist there. That, to me, is the beginning of the war in eastern Ukraine, beyond Crimea and southern Ukraine. And I saw it then. We saw the little green men. They didn't wear uniforms, so Putin could pretend that they weren't Russian. Everyone knew they weren't Russian. They didn't want to deal with it. It's a story I tell all the time, which is, I was in eastern Ukraine, and I was seeing, I was in Donetsk when Western journalists could still go in Donetsk. And I saw Russian soldiers, essentially people wandering around. And every time I read an article, I had to say, I've seen these people, but Putin says that, but Moscow insists they're not in Ukraine. This was nonsense. But it was the clear example of a narrative war being conducted alongside a physical one. And the fact we never called this out early enough, the fact that we were never completely strong on it from the beginning, meant our problems just grew and grew and grew. Look, Putin, he razed Chechnya, destroyed it, nobody did anything. He marched into Georgia, nobody did anything. He took Crimea, nobody did anything. And then we wonder why we are where we are now. And, it's Ukraine. Ukrainians have fought back without help. And now he's starting to send drones into Poland. At what point do we not refuse to understand the pattern here? But because he, still takes care to at least meet with Donald Trump, because he still has lots of his bots and trolls flooding social media, because RT is still doing its malignant work across various parts of the world. The narrative war continues to justify this unjustifiable imperialist and brutal war on the ground against Ukraine and so many others like it.
Yes, David. And you, as a person who was in Ukraine since 2014, since Russia's beginning of the war, even let's be clear, remember that the war on the Donbass were something far away from Kyiv, and especially something far away from Western Ukraine, from Lviv, Uzhhorod, Mukachevo, and other cities. So I think now we have a broader picture. The same thing happening, just, the whole Europe are involved. So, to be honest, I remember those days, and people were living peacefully on the Western Ukraine, in central Ukraine, while people on the Donbass were dying.
Absolutely. Look, there was a real cognitive dissonance, a disconnect. I was living in Kiev on Kreshchatyk, and I would take the train to the east, and, I would be there with soldiers, driving in convoys with armored vehicles, sleeping in a tent outside Donetsk. And then I'd come back to Kiev, and it was like a different country. There was no war. There weren't even attacks on Kiev then. There were no air raids like you have now all the time. Yeah, and I think now, the world is understanding. Look, it is my belief, and I'm, as a key part of my next book, that in many ways the 21st century is born in Ukraine. That's when we see the return to great power, naked imperial politics, the return of mass industrial warfare to the European continent, the emergence of a new public sphere, these massive social media platforms, algorithmically curated to privilege going viral above all else. The first troll farms, organised one that I wrote about in my book. One of my proudest moments is having the book translated into Ukrainian and being used by the armed forces of Ukraine. All of these things were first visible in Ukraine. What we now discern as an understandably 21st century milieu or environment, the return of war, the huge uptick in digitally created or enhanced propaganda, all of these things Ukraine, and we see in Ukraine first. So it remains to this day incredibly important for the West that Ukraine holds and does not fall to this atavistic, brutal 19th, 18th, 17th, 16th, 15th century Russian imperialism that has never, ever gone away.
Yeah, and you read in that modern wars are fought online as much as on the battlefield, right? And in that case, let's be honest, Russia is a monster. And right now, who is... well, let's give them that credit. They are very strong and they're spending a lot of money to their propaganda. So right now, who is winning the narrative war around Ukraine and why?
It's a good question. It depends in what part of the world you talk about. I think in Africa, parts of what we would once call the non-aligned movement, you know, the global south as we call it, it's probably winning the war. I think in Europe, Russia still loses the narrative war in terms of people understand that this is just a war of an aggression, an unprovoked war of aggression and imperialism. You know, in the US, Russia's narrative war at the levels that matter, the administration is probably more successful than Ukraine's now for a change. But let's see. If you look at the polling, Trump's views on Ukraine are out of step, even with the Republican voters. You know, from a political point of view, if I was Zelensky and those around him, I would be trying to do everything possible to delay things until the midterms and hope a greater degree of sanity prevails in Washington. But I don't know. And look, let's also understand something else, you know. A lot of the charges leveled against Zelensky, a lot of the charges about Ukrainian corruption, this and that, they're not untrue, right? There is a serious problem in Ukraine with corruption, as I know, you know, over many years of being in the country. But that is also unquestionably being weaponized against Zelensky. I mean, the whole idea of trying to hold elections, for example, in a time of war, where you're getting air raids every day, the idea you could put millions of people queuing on the street in that environment, not least also when a large portion of the population is away fighting, can't vote, was always fundamentally unserious. So Zelensky is being attacked by what is in many ways, you know, in many parts, not completely, at all, a hostile White House now.
Yes, David. And recently I saw two interesting materials in BBC. One was about how long Britain could fight for if war broke out tomorrow. And another one was that the UK is preparing for a possible war, and not military, but psychologically. It's preparing society. What is your take on that?
I mean, yeah, the British Armed Forces are in a bit of a state now. They've been cut, you know, cuts after cuts after cuts over many years. But it retains a core professional army that is still quite effective, as diminished as it is. Look, in terms of preparing for any kind of a psychological war, this is a point I also make. We are stuck in much of the West on this World War II paradigm of war. The way we understand war is that it's two armies, you know, they both wear uniforms, they stand on a battlefield, they have a fight, the fight ends, you have a political settlement, the war ends. It's not how Russia fights wars. Is the UK preparing for, to be at war with Russia? Ukraine has been at war. Russia's been at war with the UK for 20 years, informationally, through the weaponization of corruption, through buying up London property, through, the hiring of London law firms, art galleries, private schools, all of these things. War exists now. It's not like a light bulb that you switch it on and off. It's not like being pregnant, whether you are or you aren't. War continues on and on and on. And the Russian psychological assault on Britain, the informational assault on Britain, the propaganda assault on Britain, just look at the content coming out of RT, is long-standing. And this is recognised by people in Britain, in the government and in the military. I think perhaps increasingly by the population. But let's get rid of this idea once and for all that wars are fought like they were in World War II now. They're not fought like that. Russia sent people to Salisbury Plain in Britain to kill a British agent. They did that flagrantly. And then Putin put them on TV basically laughing, saying, oh no, we were just tourists going to visit Salisbury Cathedral. That, to my mind, is a hostile act by a hostile state. I mean, it's very, very clear. So we don't need to prepare for anything in Britain, any war. We're already in it. We've been in it for a long time.
Yeah. And if you had to name one narrative the West must urgently abandon in 2025 when it comes to Ukraine, what would it be, David?
So I'm going to say that it's a broader one that affects everything, especially Ukraine. The narrative is this. Stop the narrative that the West is evil, the West is colonial, the West is this, the West is that, and understand the West, for all its flaws, has brought more progress and human rights to the world than any other civilization. It's time to understand that. It's time to understand that Ukraine is a garrison, our border defenses against barbarism, anti-enlightenment principles and imperialism that's coming from Russia and other states like Russia. Believe in Britain, believe in the West, believe in Ukraine. It's high time we understood that.
And the last one, many experts now say that if this war is not resolved by its fourth year, the fourth year or full-scale invasion, meaning by February 2026, it will become even harsher and more destructive. From what you see, David, from what you analyze, do you agree that the time is actually working against everyone, not just Ukraine?
Look, in the end, by saying by the 24th of February next year is an arbitrary date. Arbitrary in the sense that I know it's not arbitrary, it's the anniversary, but the war's pretty nasty now already. I have friends in Odessa I spoke to this morning who have not had electricity for 2 days now. So it's already nasty. And winter is here, and I know what Ukrainian winters are like, especially in the east. The longer this goes on theoretically, right, the more it benefits Russia, let's be honest, because it's much larger, it has more people, and it can treat its people like dirt, and it doesn't matter. That said, Russia is also suffering, It's losing a lot of men, and even Russia can't lose men forever. There are sanctions on it. It does seem that the EU is hopefully getting itself together. The longer it goes on, it's no good for anybody, but I just can't see a way out of this unless Ukraine keeps fighting and fighting. Eventually there is some kind of easy ceasefire. I don't think there'll be a full-out peace that may last 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, like North and South Korea.
Yeah, probably, this is the most realistic scenario for us, to be honest, David. David, thank you for your time. I enjoyed it, your answers, your insights, and I hope to see you again online or offline in our studio.
For sure. I am going to be in Ukraine soon. I love it very much. And let me say once again, thank you to all of us, to you, to all Ukrainians for continuing to fight for the West and for freedom and civilization. Thank you.
Thank you too.